The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the ninth floor of Henderson Media Tower. Evelyn Hartman stepped out, her heels clicking against the polished marble as she headed toward her corner office. At 35, she commanded respect in every boardroom she entered, her sharp intellect matched only by her unwavering determination. But today, something unusual caught her eye. A man in custodial uniform standing before the old piano that had been gathering dust in the lobby for months. He wasn't cleaning it. He was simply staring, his weathered hands hovering inches from the keys, as if they held some forbidden secret. Evelyn paused, crossing her arms with an amused smile playing at her lips. "If you can play Chopin," she called out, her voice carrying across the empty space. "I'll marry you." The words escaped before she could stop them, half joke, half challenge. She had no idea she had just opened a door that would change everything. The man who turned to face her carried stories in his eyes that most people his age had never lived. Daniel Carter, 40 years old, had once been destined for concert halls and standing ovations. His fingers had danced across ivory keys in ways that made audiences weep, his interpretation of Chopin's nocturnes earning him invitations to perform at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. The music critics of the early 2000s had called him a poet of the piano, predicting a career that would span decades and inspire generations. But that was before life rewrote his symphony in a minor key. Before Sarah's cancer diagnosis at 28, when the world suddenly became about chemotherapy schedules instead of concert dates. Before he chose love over fame, staying by her hospital bed instead of boarding a plane to Paris for what would have been his European debut. Sarah had been more than his wife. She had been his first audience, his most honest critic, and his greatest source of inspiration. They had met at Juilliard, two young musicians convinced they could change the world through art. She played violin with a technical precision that complemented his emotional interpretation of the classics. And together, they had dreamed of performing as a duo in the great halls of Europe. But cancer had stolen those dreams one cell at a time, leaving Daniel to watch the woman he loved fade away while their newborn daughter slept peacefully in a hospital bassinet, unaware that her world was already breaking apart. After Sarah's death, Daniel had tried to continue performing, believing that music could somehow heal the gaping wound in his chest. But every note felt hollow, every performance a betrayal of the joy they had once shared. The final blow came 3 years later, when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything again. Lena survived the crash, but the head trauma had stolen her hearing, plunging her into a world of silence at the age when most children were learning to sing nursery rhymes. In that hospital room, watching his daughter struggle to understand why the world had suddenly gone quiet, Daniel made a decision that would define the next 7 years of his life. He would put away his music and focus entirely on being the father Lena needed, learning sign language and advocacy, and how to navigate systems designed for hearing children. The custodial job at Henderson Media Tower was not what Daniel Carter had imagined for his 40s, but it provided steady income and health insurance, two things that mattered more than artistic fulfillment when you were raising a child with special needs. His coworkers knew him as quiet and reliable, never suspecting that the man who cleaned their offices had once received standing ovations from audiences of thousands. Evelyn's world existed 30 floors above the streets, where Daniel raised his daughter, in a penthouse office that overlooked Manhattan like a throne room. Henderson Media Tower was her empire, built through calculated risks and 18-hour workdays that had paid off beyond her wildest expectations. She had started as an intern fresh out of business school, armed with nothing but ambition and a willingness to outwork everyone around her. 20 years later, she controlled a media conglomerate worth billions, her decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of consumers worldwide. The view from her office encompassed Central Park and the Hudson River, a daily reminder of how far she had climbed from her middle-class origins in suburban Connecticut. But success had come at a cost that Evelyn was only beginning to understand. Her relationships were professional rather than personal. Her conversations focused on profit margins and market share, instead of hopes and dreams. The penthouse apartment she called home was featured in architectural magazines, its minimalist design and expensive furnishings creating spaces that were beautiful but cold. She ate dinner alone most nights, scrolling through reports on her tablet while picking at salads from restaurants where celebrities dined and photographers waited outside. Music had once been Evelyn's escape from the pressures of academic achievement and parental expectations. During her teenage years, she had spent countless hours at the family piano, losing herself in Chopin's nocturnes and Debussy's impressionist landscapes. Her technique had been good enough to earn admission to Juilliard's pre-college program, where she studied alongside other gifted young musicians who dreamed of careers on stage. But her parents, both successful lawyers, had viewed music as an expensive hobby rather than a viable profession. They had pushed her toward business school, arguing that art was a luxury she couldn't afford and that financial security should take priority over creative fulfillment. Now, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success, Evelyn wondered if she had made the right choice. If the music she had abandoned might have led to a different kind of happiness. The silence in her life wasn't the comfortable quiet of contentment. It was the hollow echo of a woman who had achieved everything she thought she wanted, only to discover that success without connection felt remarkably like failure. The old piano on the 9th floor had been a fixture of the building since its construction in the 1980s, a remnant from the previous owner who had believed that corporate spaces should include touches of culture and beauty. Most employees walked past it without a second glance, treating it as expensive furniture rather than a musical instrument. But Daniel found himself drawn to it during his nightly rounds, remembering the weight of keys beneath his fingers and the way music could transform time and space. Several nights passed before Daniel encountered the piano again. This time, it had been tuned, its keys gleaming under the lobby's recessed lighting. A maintenance worker mentioned that Miss Prostand, Hartman had personally requested the restoration, though no one understood why. She came down here herself to check on the work, the man explained, polishing the bench with careful attention to detail. Said something about wanting it to be concert-ready, in case anyone with real talent ever decided to play it. Seemed to think it was important that everything be perfect. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, memories flooding back of Sarah listening to him practice. Her eyes closed in pure contentment as his fingers found the emotional core of each piece. That evening, Daniel found himself lingering longer than usual in the 9th floor lobby, his cleaning supplies forgotten. As he stood before the restored instrument, the building was empty except for security guards making their rounds, and the occasional executive working late into the night. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of years pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought about Evelyn's challenge, wondering if she had been serious or simply making conversation with someone she assumed was just part of the building's invisible workforce. Either way, something inside him was awakening after years of dormancy, a hunger that had been buried beneath responsibility and grief, but never truly extinguished. When he finally returned home that morning, the sun was already painting the Queen's skyline in shades of gold and pink. Lena was awake early, as she often was, sitting at their small kitchen table with her sketchbook and a box of colored pencils that Mrs. Rodriguez had given her for her last birthday. She looked up as he entered, her expressive eyes studying his face with the intuitive wisdom that children often possess. Her hands moved in the fluid gestures of sign language, asking why he looked different today, why his eyes seemed to be holding secrets. "Daddy looks like he's remembering something beautiful," she signed, tilting her head with curiosity. "Your face has music in it again." The observation caught him off guard, reminding him once again that his daughter saw the world with an artist's eye, noticing details that adults often missed in their rush through daily life. The community center 3 blocks from Daniel's apartment building had seen better days, its brick facade weathered by decades of New York winters, and its interior spaces worn by countless meetings and events. But in the basement, past the storage rooms, filled with folding chairs and seasonal decorations, sat an old upright piano that had been donated by a church during the 1990s. The instrument was terribly out of tune, several keys stuck from humidity damage, and the pedals squeaked with each use, but it was functional enough for someone desperate to make music again. The night janitor, a kind man named Miguel who had worked there for 15 years, had given Daniel a key in exchange for covering a few of his shifts during particularly busy weeks. For 2 weeks, Daniel had been making these pilgrimages after his shift at the tower, slipping into the quiet basement and approaching the piano like a penitent, returning to an abandoned altar. His first attempts were humbling, his fingers stumbling over passages that had once flowed like water from his memory, muscle memory warred with mental blocks, technique fighting against emotion, as he worked through scales and arpeggios that felt foreign after years of neglect. But gradually, something began to shift. The piano responded to his touch despite its flaws, and he found himself remembering not just the notes, but the feelings that had once made him a compelling performer. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major had been Sarah's favorite piece, the music he had played during their wedding ceremony while she walked down the aisle in her grandmother's dress. Now he worked through it measure by measure, rebuilding not just his technical ability but his emotional connection to a part of himself he thought had died with her. Each practice session became a dialogue with his past, a negotiation between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, between the dreams he had abandoned and the possibilities that might still exist. Lena had begun following him to these late-night sessions, curling up on a folding chair with her sketchbook while he worked through his repertoire. She couldn't hear the music in the traditional sense, but she could feel the vibrations through the floor, could see the emotion in his posture as he played. Her drawings from these evenings were extraordinary abstract compositions of color and movement that somehow captured the essence of music without sound. Blues and purples swirled across her pages when he played Chopin's more melancholic pieces, while bright yellows and oranges danced during the lighter passages. She was creating her own language for music, translating sound into visual poetry, with an instinct that amazed her father. One night, as he finished a particularly difficult passage that had been giving him trouble for days, Lena approached the piano and placed her small hands on its wooden case. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she felt the instrument's vibrations travel through her palms and up her arms, her face lighting up with discovery. Through sign language, she told him that she could feel the music in her chest, that it made colors appear behind her closed eyelids, like fireworks on the 4th of July. "I can't hear it the way other people do, Daddy," she signed, tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I can feel your heart in every note." The transformation in Daniel's demeanor didn't go unnoticed by the sharp eyes that had built a media empire from nothing. Evelyn had initially forgotten about her impulsive challenge to the custodian, chalking it up to a moment of whimsy in an otherwise carefully structured life. But she found herself paying attention to the building's invisible workforce in ways she never had before, particularly the quiet man who seemed to approach the 9th-floor piano with something approaching reverence. There was something in his posture when he stood before the instrument, the way his hands moved even when he wasn't touching the keys, that suggested familiarity beyond casual interest. He moved like someone who understood music from the inside out, who had spent years learning to coax emotion from ivory and ebony. One evening, working late on quarterly reports that would determine the company's direction for the next fiscal year, Evelyn heard something that made her pause mid-sentence. Music was drifting through the building's ventilation system, faint but unmistakable. It was Chopin, played with a technique that was slightly rusty around the edges, but emotionally devastating in its honesty. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere below, and following it led her to a conference room on the 7th floor that faced the street. Through the window, she could see the community center across the way, where a figure was hunched over an old piano in a basement room, his silhouette barely visible through the grimy glass. Even from that distance, even without being able to see his face clearly, She knew it was him. There was something about the way he held himself at the keyboard, the particular tilt of his head, when he concentrated on difficult passages, that confirmed her suspicion. Evelyn found herself returning to that conference room each night thereafter, listening to his practice sessions like a secret she couldn't share with anyone else. The music he played wasn't perfect. There were missed notes, hesitations, moments where emotion seemed to overwhelm technique, but it was alive in ways that polished concert recordings never managed to capture. It spoke of loss and hope, of love that transcended death, of beauty that could exist even in broken things and wounded hearts. Curiosity eventually overcame professional boundaries, leading Evelyn to ask her assistant to research the building's custodial staff. What she discovered about Daniel Carter kept her awake for 3 nights straight, her mind reeling with implications she hadn't expected. He had been magnificent once, a rising star whose career trajectory had pointed toward the highest levels of classical performance. Old reviews described his playing as transcendent and emotionally fearless, while photographs from his concert days showed a younger man whose entire being seemed to glow with artistic purpose. Articles from the early 2000s detailed his rapid ascent through the classical music world, his engagement to fellow musician Sarah Brennan, and their plans to tour Europe as a piano-violin duo. But somewhere around 2006, the coverage had simply stopped. Daniel Carter had vanished from the concert circuit as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only questions and speculation about what might have derailed such a promising career. The last article Evelyn could find was a brief mention in a classical music journal about the cancellation of his European tour due to personal circumstances. But no further details were provided. She spent an entire weekend watching grainy YouTube videos of his performances, studying his face for clues about the man he had been before life had reshaped him into someone who cleaned office buildings for a living. What struck her most about those old performances was the pure joy that radiated from his entire being when he played. His face would transform the moment his fingers touched the keys, years seeming to fall away as he surrendered completely to the music flowing through him. There was no self-consciousness in his performance, no awareness of the audience or the cameras or the critical eyes watching his every move. He played as if the music was a language he had been born speaking, as if the piano was simply an extension of his soul rather than an external instrument requiring technical mastery. Watching him play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Evelyn found herself crying for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, moved by the obvious love affair between this man and his art. "Why did you stop?" she whispered to the computer screen, though she was beginning to understand that the answer was probably more heartbreaking than she was prepared to handle. The revelation about Daniel's true identity changed everything for Evelyn, adding layers of complexity to what had begun as a simple workplace interaction. She began learning American Sign Language using online tutorials and mobile apps, practicing during lunch breaks and memorizing basic conversations that might be useful if she ever met his daughter. The learning process was humbling for someone accustomed to mastering new skills quickly, but she persevered with a determination that surprised even her. When she finally encountered Daniel and Lena in the building's lobby the following week, she was able to sign a simple greeting to the little girl, whose face immediately lit up with surprise and delight at finding someone new who could communicate in her language. Daniel's shock was even more pronounced than his daughter's joy. Here was his employer, this powerful woman in her expensive designer suit and Italian leather shoes, taking the time to learn sign language and engage with his daughter as an equal rather than an object of pity. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to suppress. But Evelyn could see the gratitude in his eyes, could read the story of countless interactions where well-meaning people had either ignored Lena entirely or spoken about her as if she wasn't present. "Yes, I did," Evelyn replied, watching Lena sign enthusiastically about her latest drawing project for school. Everyone deserves to be heard, regardless of how they communicate. What began as occasional encounters in the lobby gradually evolved into something neither of them had expected or planned. Evelyn found herself creating reasons to work late, timing her departures to coincide with Daniel's arrival for his evening shift. Their conversations were initially brief and professional discussions about building maintenance, weather patterns, or general observations about city life, but gradually deepened as trust developed between them, like a slowly blooming flower. Lena became the bridge that connected their vastly different worlds, her innocent questions and unfiltered observations breaking down the artificial barriers that separated a corporate executive from a night janitor. The little girl would show Evelyn her artwork, with the pride of someone sharing precious treasures, elaborate scenes of families and music and dreams rendered in crayon and colored pencil that revealed a sophisticated understanding of emotion and relationship. Each drawing was a window into her silent but vibrant inner world, populated by characters who communicated through gesture and expression rather than spoken words. Evelyn found herself looking forward to these impromptu art exhibitions more than board meetings or client presentations, touched by Lena's ability to find beauty and story in everyday experiences that most adults overlooked in their rush through busy schedules. During one of these lobby conversations, Lena asked Evelyn why she looked sad sometimes, her small hands forming the question with a directness that caught the CEO off guard. Through Daniel's translation, the child explained that she could see sadness in people's faces even when they were smiling, that Evelyn carried a particular kind of loneliness that reminded her of her father during his worst periods of grief. The evening, Evelyn invited Daniel and Lena to her corner office marked a turning point that none of them could have predicted. Her executive suite contained amenities that most people only saw in magazine spreads: imported furniture, original artwork, and a view of Manhattan that seemed to stretch on forever. But the centerpiece of the room was something she had inherited from the building's previous owner and never bothered to remove. A baby grand piano that sat in the corner like an expensive piece of furniture, its polished black surface reflecting the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had walked past it thousands of times without giving it a second thought, but tonight it seemed to pulse with possibility. "I thought maybe," she began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of what she was suggesting. The power dynamics were complicated. She was, after all, his employer, and any gesture could be misinterpreted as either charity or manipulation. "Would you play something? For Lena?" The request hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple entertainment. Daniel approached the instrument with the reverence of someone returning to a sacred space after years of exile, his weathered hands finding the keys as if greeting old friends who had been waiting patiently for his return. When he began Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece he had been practicing obsessively in the community center basement, the sterile corporate environment transformed into something magical and alive. Lena positioned herself beside the piano bench, her small hands pressed against the instrument's wooden case to feel every vibration that traveled through its frame. Evelyn found herself remembering her own childhood, hours spent at her family's upright piano before practical concerns and parental pressure had redirected her path toward business school and corporate success. As Daniel played, she began unconsciously tapping out the melody's rhythm on her desktop, an unconscious echo of the way her mother used to conduct, along with classical radio programs during Sunday afternoon cleaning sessions. The three of them existed in that moment outside of normal time, connected by music that transcended the barriers of hearing impairment and social class and professional hierarchy. When the last note faded into the ambient hum of the building's heating system, they sat in comfortable silence, each processing what had just occurred in their own way. The idea for what would become the Tactile concert series came to Evelyn during a sleepless night several weeks later, her mind churning with possibilities she had never considered before, discovering this hidden corner of Daniel's world. Henderson Media Tower had a small auditorium on the third floor that was primarily used for product launches and investor presentations, equipped with a sophisticated sound system that could be modified to emphasize vibration and bass frequencies. She began researching programs for deaf and hard-of-hearing audiences, reaching out to music therapists and educators who specialized in making live performances accessible to people who experience sound differently than the general population. The response to her inquiries was overwhelming and educational in equal measure. Apparently, very few venues offered tactile music experiences, and the waiting lists for existing programs were extensive, sometimes stretching months into the future. Parents of deaf children described the frustration of wanting to share their love of music with offspring who couldn't access it through traditional means, while educators explained the therapeutic and developmental benefits of exposing hearing-impaired individuals to rhythm and vibration. Within 3 weeks, Evelyn had organized an evening specifically designed for deaf and hard-of-hearing children and their families, working with specialists to modify the auditorium's acoustics and seating arrangements to maximize the physical sensation of musical performance. Daniel initially resisted the idea of performing publicly, his confidence still fragile after years away from the stage and the pressures of professional scrutiny. But Lena's excitement about the prospect of sharing her unique way of experiencing music with other children ultimately convinced him to participate. He spent 2 weeks carefully selecting a program that would translate well to tactile appreciation pieces with strong rhythmic elements and emotional clarity that could be felt as easily as heard. The repertoire ranged from Chopin's most accessible nocturnes to contemporary compositions written specifically for mixed audiences of hearing and deaf listeners, each piece chosen for its ability to communicate through vibration and visual performance, as much as auditory beauty. The evening of the first tactile concert, 30 families filled the modified auditorium with an energy unlike anything Evelyn had ever experienced in a corporate setting. Children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers sat on specially designed mats near the stage, their hands pressed against the wooden platform to feel every note that emerged from the piano. Parents watched their children's faces with expressions of wonder and gratitude, many seeing their offspring engage with music for the first time in their lives. The atmosphere was intimate and expectant, filled with a kind of anticipation that had nothing to do with critical judgment and everything to do with the pure joy of shared discovery. Lena sat in the front row with her sketchbook and a fresh box of 64 colored pencils, ready to capture the colors and shapes that music created in her synesthetic imagination. As Daniel began his first piece, a gentle interpretation of Chopin's Minute Waltz, she immediately began drawing, her hand moving across the paper in fluid motions that seemed to mirror the music's rhythm and emotional flow. Other children watched her work with fascination, some attempting their own artistic interpretations of what they were feeling through their palms and bodies. The concert became a multimedia experience, combining auditory, tactile, and visual elements in ways that transcended traditional performance boundaries. As Daniel progressed through his carefully curated program, Evelyn found herself positioned at the back of the auditorium, tears streaming down her face as she watched magic unfold before her eyes. This wasn't about perfect technique or critical acclaim or career advancement. This was about connection in its purest form, about art serving its highest purpose, by bringing joy and understanding to people who needed it most. When Daniel finished his final piece, a contemporary composition that incorporated percussion elements the children could feel through the floor, the audience's appreciation was expressed not through traditional applause, but through raised hands waving in the deaf community's visual equivalent of clapping, a silent symphony of gratitude that was more moving than any standing ovation she had ever witnessed. In the quiet aftermath of the concert, as families departed and the auditorium slowly returned to its usual corporate neutrality, Evelyn found herself alone with Daniel and Lena in the space where something extraordinary had just occurred. The little girl had fallen asleep in her father's arms, exhausted by the evening's emotional intensity, but clutching her sketchbook filled with colorful interpretations of the music she had experienced through touch and vibration. Her drawings were extraordinary abstract compositions that somehow captured the essence of each piece Daniel had played, translating sound into visual poetry with an instinctive understanding that amazed the adults who studied her work. About what I said that first day, Evelyn began, her voice barely above a whisper in the dimmed auditorium. About marrying whoever could play Chopin, Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, his arms cradling his sleeping daughter, while his eyes searched her face for clues about where this conversation might lead. The words she had spoken months earlier as a casual joke now carried weight neither of them had anticipated, loaded with implications that went far beyond musical ability or professional hierarchy. "I think I was looking for something I didn't know how to name," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she found the courage to speak honestly about feelings she was still learning to understand. "I thought it was about the music, about finding someone who could play Chopin because that represented sophistication or culture or some kind of artistic validation I felt I was missing from my life. But it wasn't about that at all. It was about finding someone who understood that some things are more important than perfection, someone who could see beauty in broken things and wounded hearts, someone who knew that the spaces between the notes are just as important as the notes themselves." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in ways that neither of them was accustomed to in their carefully constructed adult lives. Daniel shifted Lena's weight in his arms, studying Evelyn's face in the dim lighting that remained after the concert's conclusion. "I stopped playing for 7 years," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "After Sarah died, after Lena lost her hearing, I thought music was something that belonged to my past, something I had to sacrifice in order to be the father she needed. I convinced myself that art was a luxury I couldn't afford, that practical concerns had to take priority over creative expression." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion as he continued. "But watching her tonight, seeing how she experiences sound through touch and vibration, seeing how other children like her responded to music in ways I never imagined possible, I realized I wasn't honoring Sarah's memory by staying silent. I was dishonoring it. You gave me permission to remember who I used to be," Daniel continued, his eyes meeting Evelyn's with an intensity that made her heart race. "But more importantly, you helped me discover who I could become. Not just a father struggling to provide for his daughter, not just a former musician living in the past, but someone who could use his gifts to build bridges between different worlds." Lena stirred in her father's arms, her eyes opening to focus on Evelyn with the clarity that children often possess when they're emerging from sleep but not yet fully awakened to the complexities of adult conversation. Through drowsy sign language, she asked a question that made both adults freeze in place. Their careful navigation of emotional territory suddenly interrupted by the kind of innocent directness that only children can manage. "Is Miss Evelyn going to be my new mommy?" The inquiry hung in the air between them, neither having fully acknowledged where their growing connection might lead, neither having discussed the practical realities of merging lives that had been shaped by vastly different circumstances and expectations. Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment at his daughter's blunt question, but Evelyn knelt down to Lena's eye level, her hands forming careful signs as she responded with the honesty she had learned was the only appropriate currency in conversations with this remarkable child. "Would you like that?" Lena nodded solemnly, her expression serious as she considered the implications of such a dramatic change in their family structure. Then, with the wisdom that often accompanies early loss and the resulting emotional maturity, she added something that brought fresh tears to both adults' eyes. "Daddy needs someone to help him remember how to smile when he's not playing music." 18 months later, the 9th floor piano had become the heart of something beautiful and unexpected, a symbol of transformation that extended far beyond the 3 lives it had originally brought together. Every Thursday evening, Henderson Media Tower's auditorium hosted Silent Symphonies, a concert series designed for hearing-impaired audiences that had gained national attention and inspired similar programs in cities across the country. Music therapy programs were citing the initiative as a model for inclusive performance, while educators were developing curricula that incorporated tactile music experiences for students with various learning differences and physical challenges. What had begun as an impulsive challenge from a lonely CEO to a mysterious custodian had evolved into a movement that was changing how people thought about accessibility and the universal human need for artistic connection. Daniel had resigned from his custodial position to become the program's full-time musical director, his days now filled with lesson planning, performance preparation, and collaboration with therapists and educators who specialized in adaptive music instruction. But more importantly, he had learned to balance his roles as father, partner, and artist, without sacrificing any essential part of himself. The community center piano, where he had first rediscovered his love of music, now sat in their living room, donated by Miguel when the center received funding for a new instrument. On quiet Sunday mornings, the house would fill with imperfect but joyful sound as Daniel played. Lena sketched, and Evelyn worked through violin exercises on an instrument she had taken up after 25 years away from serious musical study. Evelyn kept the Steinway in her office, where it served as a daily reminder that the most important decisions in life often come disguised as casual remarks made during moments of vulnerability or whimsy. She had learned sign language fluently enough to conduct board meetings with Lena as her unofficial translator, a sight that never failed to amuse her business partners, and had actually improved her company's reputation for innovation and social responsibility. The three of them had created a family that looked nothing like traditional expectations, but functioned with a harmony that would have made Chopin himself proud of the way they had learned to blend their individual melodies into something greater than the sum of its parts. Their home was filled with music now, not just the kind that emerged from piano keys and violin strings, but the kind that grew from understanding, patience, and love that had learned to communicate in multiple languages. The drawing Lena had created on the night of their first concert together now hung framed behind Evelyn's desk, a child's interpretation of three figures standing beside a piano with musical notes floating around them like snowflakes or butterflies. Beneath the image, in Lena's careful handwriting, were the words that had become their family motto: Chopin made Mommy cry. Daddy made music live again. But it was Evelyn's quiet observation, spoken during one of their late-night practice sessions, when the three of them gathered around the piano to work through pieces that challenged each of their abilities in different ways, that truly captured what they had discovered together. I wasn't looking for a pianist. I was looking for someone who knows when not to play. In the spaces between the notes, in the silences that made music possible, they had discovered that love, like great art, was not about perfection but about presence, not about what was heard, but about what was felt, deeply and completely, in the chambers of the heart.